The boy hadn't laughed in 14 months. Adeline Marsh knew this because his father told her. Not as a confession, not as a warning, but the way someone states a fact they've accepted so completely it no longer hurts to say out loud. He said it the way you'd say the furnace broke last winter or the roof needs replacing. Matter of fact, done grieving the detail itself. But Adeline wasn't done with it. She was still thinking about it 40 minutes later, refilling the hot water urn at the back of the café, watching steam curl up toward the exposed pipes on the ceiling. 14 months. She counted backwards in her head. That was around November of last year. She wondered what November had taken from them. The café was called Birchwood, and it sat on the corner of Harvard and Spadina in Toronto, the kind of place that had been there long enough to feel permanent. Scuffed hardwood floors, mismatched chairs, a chalkboard menu that nobody ever fully erased, just layered new items over the ghosts of old ones. Adeline had worked there for 3 years. She knew every regular by their order and most of them by name, knew which booths got cold drafts in January, knew the exact angle to tilt the portafilter to get a clean pull on a particularly stubborn morning. She did not know until that Tuesday in October that she was about to become the most important stranger in a little boy's life. He came in first. The boy. His name was Felix, though Adeline wouldn't learn that until later. He was 7, maybe 8, with the kind of dark curly hair that looked like it had opinions about being combed, and he was wearing a dinosaur backpack that was clearly too big for him. The bottom hem hit the backs of his knees. He pushed the door open with both hands and stood in the entrance for a moment, looking around the café with wide, serious eyes. Not shy, just observant, taking inventory. He didn't say anything to anyone. He walked directly to the corner booth by the window, the one Adeline privately called the best seat in the house, where the morning light came in sideways and turned everything gold, and sat down. Set his backpack on the bench beside him, folded his hands on the table. His father came in 30 seconds later, slightly out of breath, a travel mug in one hand and his phone in the other. He stopped when he saw Felix already seated, and something in his face did a complicated thing. Relief and sadness and something else Adeline couldn't quite name, all passing through in under a second. The father was tall, dark coat, open at the collar. Late 30s, she guessed, though there was something tired around his eyes that made it hard to tell. Not from lack of sleep, but from the specific exhaustion of carrying something heavy for a long time. He had the kind of face that might have been openly expressive once. Now it was careful. He slid into the booth across from Felix and set his phone face down on the table. That detail, phone face down, Adeline noticed. Most people didn't do that anymore. She gave them a minute before she went over. "Good morning," she said, pulling out her notepad out of habit. "Can I get you started with something?" The father looked up. "Coffee, please. Black if you have something dark roasted." He glanced at Felix. "And for him, whatever he wants." Adeline looked at Felix. He was looking back at her with those same serious eyes, still hadn't spoken. "We've got a hot chocolate that's pretty legendary," she said to him. "Real cocoa, not the powder stuff. We put a little cardamom in it, which sounds weird, but I promise it's good." Felix studied her. Then, very deliberately, he lifted one hand and moved it in a small, precise gesture. Adeline's heart did something unexpected. She knew that sign. She'd learned ASL, American Sign Language, close enough to what's used in English Canada. Years ago, when her younger sister Clea was first diagnosed with moderate hearing loss at age 4, Adeline had spent 2 years in weekly classes and approximately 1,000 hours practicing with Clea in their parents' kitchen in Hamilton. She was fluent, not professionally, not credentialed, but genuinely, conversationally fluent. Felix had signed yes. She signed back, hot chocolate with cardamom. Good choice, and watched his face. His eyes went wide. Not shocked exactly. More like someone who'd stopped expecting a door to open and then watched it swing wide anyway. She brought the coffee first, then the hot chocolate. And she didn't make a big deal out of any of it. Didn't announce to the father what had happened. Just set the drinks down, smiled at Felix, who was still watching her with that careful attention, and went back to her other tables. But she kept an eye on them. The father wrapped both hands around his mug and said something to Felix. Felix looked at him. Whatever the father said, Felix didn't respond, not vocally, not in sign. He just turned to look out the window at the street. The father's jaw tightened slightly. He looked down at the table. This, Adeline understood, was a regular wound, not a fresh one. She came back to check on them 20 minutes later, and this time she timed it so she was facing Felix when she approached. She signed, casually, like it was nothing. "Is the hot chocolate okay?" Felix sat up straight. He signed back immediately, faster this time. "It's the best one I ever had," Adeline grinned. She signed, "I'll tell the cook. He'll be very proud." Felix pressed his lips together in the way kids do when they're trying not to smile and failing completely. His shoulders shook once. It wasn't quite a laugh, but it was the beginning of one. Across the table, his father had gone very still. She didn't know his name yet. She learned it later, when he paid. The credit card read R. Calloway Grant, and she almost said something about the hyphenated name because it was such a very Canadian thing to do, but she stopped herself. He lingered at the counter while Felix got his backpack back on. "How long have you known sign language?" he asked. His voice was quieter than she expected, careful like his face. "Since I was about 20, she said. "My sister's hard of hearing. We learned together." He nodded slowly. Felix was born deaf. His mother... He stopped, started again. His mother was deaf too. She was fluent. She was his main. They talked constantly, those two, about everything. He looked over at Felix, who was pressing his nose against the window glass. "She passed away 14 months ago. There it was. November. I'm trying to learn," he said. "I've been taking classes for 6 months. But I'm slow, and Felix," he exhaled. "Felix is patient with me. He's very patient. But it's not the same as talking to someone who's fluent. He has this whole vocabulary, this whole way of, and I can only catch about half of it, maybe less." Adeline looked at Felix at the window. He'd turned around and was watching them with those serious eyes again. "He understood everything we said to each other," she told the father quietly. "I know." A pause. "I could tell." She waited. "Could I ask?" He stopped again, recalibrated. This was clearly a man who chose his words very carefully, possibly because he'd learned the cost of saying the wrong ones. "Would you be open to coming back, or—" "Not coming back, you work here, I mean. Would you mind if we came back, and if you had a moment, just to talk to him? Sign with him?" "He hasn't." His voice did something small and difficult. He cleared his throat. "He's been pretty quiet, for a while now. His name was Reid, Reid Calloway Grant. He was a structural engineer." She learned this over the following weeks, piece by piece. The way you learn things about people when you see them twice a week across a café counter. He worked for a firm downtown that did infrastructure assessments, bridges mostly, and he was very good at his job, which meant he spent a lot of time thinking about whether things that looked solid were actually solid, and whether things that looked like they might collapse were actually fine. He was not, he admitted once, very good at applying this professionally diagnostic eye to his own life. He and Felix came in every Tuesday and Saturday, always the corner booth, always the same order. Felix, Adeline quickly discovered, had opinions, strong ones, clearly articulated, about everything from the playlist. He liked the jazz, disliked the folk, was neutral on the singer-songwriter stuff, to the table napkins. He preferred the blue ones, which were thicker, to the relative quality of various baked goods. The lemon square was a 7 out of 10. The almond croissant was a 9. The blueberry scone was, and this he signed with the expression of someone delivering a very official verdict, almost perfect. Adeline started saving the almond croissants for him on Saturdays. She and Felix talked, signed, about everything. Hockey, which he cared about with startling intensity for someone his size. The book he was reading, a chapter book about a boy who discovers his grandmother is secretly a botanist who's been cataloging unknown plant species in northern Ontario. A movie he'd seen 3 times. A drawing he'd done of a blue heron he'd spotted on a field trip to Tommy Thompson Park, which he described in such precise, delighted detail that Adeline could picture every feather. He was, and she thought about this often, in the quiet moments between orders, one of the most genuinely present people she'd ever met. He paid attention to everything. He missed nothing. Reid watched these conversations with an expression Adeline could only describe as learning. He'd started bringing a small notebook. He wrote down signs she used, asked her after what they meant, practiced them at the table with Felix later. Felix would watch his father's hands, correct his form with gentle precision, and once, just once, on a rainy Saturday in November, he'd signed something back to his father that made Reid's eyes go bright in a way that had nothing to do with the overhead lights. Adeline didn't ask what Felix had signed. Some things weren't hers to know. She had her own life outside Birchwood. She shared an apartment on Palmerston with her friend Deo, who worked in urban planning and had very strong opinions about bike lane infrastructure and excellent taste in takeout. She took a pottery class on Wednesday evenings that she was genuinely terrible at, which she found oddly satisfying. She called her sister Clea every Sunday, and Clea, who was 23 now and studying environmental science in Vancouver, always asked if Adeline had met anyone yet. And Adeline always said she was too busy, and Clea always said, "Addie, you literally cannot be too busy to meet someone. You work in a cafe." Adeline did not mention Reid to Clea, not for a while. It happened gradually, the way things do when you're not paying attention to the shape of them. He started arriving a few minutes early on Tuesdays when Felix was in school on the pretense of grabbing a coffee on his way to a site visit. He'd sit at the counter instead of the booth. That was different, deliberate, and they'd talk while she worked. About the city, about his job, about a podcast he was listening to about the history of Canadian railways that he described with a level of enthusiasm that she found, unexpectedly, genuinely, charming. She told him about Hamilton, about Clea, about the pottery class. He laughed when she described her most recent attempt, a mug that had collapsed into what she could only describe as a defeated pancake. It was a good laugh, quiet, a bit surprised, like he'd forgotten he could make that sound. One Tuesday in January, when the sidewalk outside was solid ice, and only the truly committed had shown up for coffee, he stayed at the counter for an hour and a half. When he finally stood to leave, he paused with his coat half on and said, "I'd like to take you to dinner sometime, if you'd want that." Adeline looked at him. What would Felix think? Reid considered this with the seriousness it deserved. "Felix," he said, "has already informed me that I am bad at talking to people and that you are one of the only exceptions." She raised an eyebrow. "He signed that to you?" "He wrote it on a sticky note and put it on the fridge." She laughed. She said yes. 3 months is long enough to know whether something is real. By April, she had met his colleagues at a firm happy hour where she'd stood beside him and signed for Felix, who'd come with his babysitter and then promptly escaped her to find Adeline, and somehow, without meaning to, become the person who made sure Felix had someone to talk to in every room. By April, she knew he took his coffee too hot and his news too slowly. He read print newspapers, actual physical ones, on Sunday mornings, and that he had a habit of solving problems by going very quiet and very still, like a building settling into its foundation. By April, she was also in love with him, which she had not planned and which Dio had announced 3 weeks before Adeline herself admitted it. "The way you described the kid," Dio said, eating noodles on their couch, "you're already in love. With both of them. I'm not. You saved him an almond croissant for 6 weeks before the dad even asked you to dinner." Adeline had no response to this. Reid's younger half-sister was named Philippa, and she wore her hair in a sleek low ponytail and had the kind of smile that reached everywhere except her eyes. Adeline met her at a dinner at Reid's house in late April, a small gathering, Reid's colleague and his wife, and Philippa, who'd come in from Vancouver for a conference and stayed the weekend. Felix sat next to Adeline at the table and showed her pictures on his tablet of the blue heron drawing, which he'd had framed and hung in his bedroom. Philippa watched this with that smile. She said the right things. She asked Adeline the right questions, where she was from, what she did, how long she'd worked at the café, and Adeline answered them. And all of it was perfectly pleasant, and yet somewhere during the salad course she felt the distinct sensation of being assessed. She told herself she was imagining it. She was not imagining it. It started small. Philippa mentioned to Reid that she'd looked up Birchwood online and noticed the cafe had received some funding from a neighborhood business development program. She said she'd also noticed, while she was looking, that the program was connected to a commercial property firm. She said she found it interesting that Adeline's cafe happened to be located in the same neighborhood as a property that Reid's firm had been retained to assess. Reid mentioned this to Adeline casually as something he'd heard. Adeline frowned. "I don't know anything about any of that, I just work there." "I know," he said, "but the seed was in." Philippa escalated. She produced, from where Adeline never found out, a photograph. It showed Adeline having coffee with a man on a patio, a man who turned out to be Dio's colleague from the urban planning office, someone Adeline had met exactly twice and had no meaningful connection to whatsoever. Philippa had circled the man in the photo with a thin red line, like a teacher marking an error, and sent it to Reid with a message that said only, "Thought you should know who she's meeting with. That's the Kellerman Group's VP of Acquisitions. Reid, please be careful." Reid did not show Adeline the message. He went quiet. That particular quiet she recognized, the settling kind, the problem-solving kind, except this time it was turned inward, away from her, and she didn't know why. She noticed it on a Wednesday. By Thursday, she noticed he hadn't responded to her last text. By Friday evening, when she stopped by his house to drop off a book Felix had asked to borrow, he opened the door looking like a man who'd been doing arithmetic that wasn't adding up. "Everything okay?" she asked. "I've had a lot on," he said. She looked at him. She looked at Felix, who'd appeared at the end of the hall and who was signing to her behind his father's back. "Dad is sad. He won't tell me why." She looked back at Reid. "Okay," she said. She handed him the book. She went home. Dio found her on the couch that night, very still, staring at nothing. "Talk," Dio said. Adeline talked. She laid it all out. The dinners, the months, the way Reid had gone quiet, the look on his face as at the door. She didn't know what had changed. She couldn't identify the variable. You said his sister was there last month, Dio said. Philippa, yeah, and after that is when this started? Adeline looked at her. I'm just asking, Dio said. She almost didn't go to the fundraiser. It was a charity gala for the pediatric audiology department at Sick Kids, and Reid had invited her weeks ago, before the quiet started, and she'd said yes and bought a dress that she was now lying next to on her bed, staring at the ceiling. Her phone buzzed. A message from Reid. I understand if you don't want to come tonight. No pressure either way. She stared at that message for a long time. Then she thought about Felix. She thought about the way he'd signed Dad as sad. He won't tell me why. She thought about the 14 months of quiet before she'd walked into that corner booth with a hot chocolate and a few signs she'd learned in her parents' kitchen in Hamilton. She thought about the almond croissant, which she had in fact been saving for weeks before Reid ever asked her to dinner, because Felix lit up when he ate it and she liked making him light up. And that was the truth of it, simple as that. She put the dress on. The gala was at the Art Gallery of Ontario, and it was full of exactly the kind of people Adeline was not, in her natural state, comfortable around. Sleek and certain, moving through the room with the confidence of people who'd never wondered whether they deserved to be there. She kept close to the edge. She found Reid near the silent auction tables. He looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite read, surprised, something else underneath. You came, he said. I came, she said. He opened his mouth. He closed it. He looked like a man standing in front of a structure he wasn't sure about, running calculations he wasn't sure were right. Felix appeared from behind him. Apparently his babysitter had the night off and he'd come along, appropriately bored, and signed to Adeline immediately. Your dress has pockets? She signed back. Obviously, he signed smart. Reid watched this. She saw something shift in his face, something she recognized from 6 months ago at a counter in a café, the look of a person watching a door swing open that they'd stopped expecting to open. Adeline, he said. His voice was low. I owe you an apology. She waited. My sister showed me something. A photo. She implied she suggested you had connections to a development group that had potential conflicts with my firm. I know how it sounds, saying it out loud. I know how it sounds, he exhaled. I should have asked you directly. I should have done that first, not last. I'm sorry. She looked at him for a moment. Then, who took the photo? I don't know yet. But it doesn't matter. You didn't do anything wrong. You were having coffee with someone you barely know, and I let someone I've known my whole life plant a story in my head without checking it against what I actually know about you. Which is, he looked at her, that you saved my son an almond croissant for 6 weeks because you noticed he liked it. That you learned a language out of love for your sister and then used it to give my kid back something I couldn't give him on my own. That you told me once that you went into pottery because you wanted to be bad at something on purpose. Because you spent too long only doing things you were already good at. A pause. I know who you are. Felix, standing between them, had been watching their faces carefully. He tapped Reid's arm. He signed. Are you done being an idiot? Reid looked at his son, then back at Adeline. Apparently not quite yet, he said. There is a particular kind of courage required for public accountability, and Reid Calloway Grant had, it turned out, exactly enough of it. He requested 5 minutes from the gala's MC. He stood at the front of a room full of people who knew him professionally and personally, and he said clearly and without hedging that he had acted on bad information and damaged the trust of someone who deserved better, and that he wanted to correct that while there were witnesses, so that she would know he meant it. Philippa left before the speech was finished. Adeline saw her go. She did not run after her. That wasn't her department. Later, walking back through the gallery with Felix between them, Adeline told Reid the things she'd been carrying since October. The things she probably should have said sooner in the name of fairness. Her family had money. Not billionaire money, but old Toronto money, her grandfather's generation, real estate and early telecom investments, the kind of comfortable inheritance that meant Adeline worked at Birchwood because she loved it, not because she needed to. She'd never mentioned it because it never came up, and because she'd spent years learning that it changed how people looked at her, and she'd liked, very much, being just the barista who knew sign language. Reid listened to all of this without interrupting. Then he said, Did you know Felix's grandmother, my mother's mother, opened the first women's cooperative hardware store in Ottawa in 1971 because she got tired of the men at the other shop explaining things to her she already knew? Adeline blinked. What? She was very wealthy by the time she died. Very quietly wealthy. He glanced at her sidelong. My point is that I'm not bothered by the inheritance. I'm bothered that you felt like you had to hide something about yourself. Even if I understand why. Felix, walking between them, reached up without looking and took both of their hands. He didn't sign anything. He didn't need to. Philippa's fabricated photo was traced, eventually, to a private investigator she'd hired, a detail that came out when Reid's firm's legal team got involved. Because the PI had accessed some information he shouldn't have, Philippa faced consequences that were formal, documented, and significant. She did not go quietly, but she did go. Reid told Adeline about it on a Saturday morning at Birchwood in the corner booth, the one with the good morning light. Felix was beside him, working on a drawing. He was doing a whole series now, watercolors of birds he'd spotted around the city. The legal side is mostly wrapped up, Reid said. She's gone back to Vancouver. Adeline nodded. How do you feel about it? He thought about this seriously, which she'd come to expect. Relieved, a bit sad. She's been competing with me for something since we were teenagers. I never knew what. He looked at his coffee. I should have seen it sooner. Before it got to you, you couldn't have known. I could have asked better questions, Reid. He looked up. You figured it out, she said. You stood up in front of a room full of your colleagues. Give yourself a little credit. Felix looked up from his drawing and signed to both of them. Also, I knew Aunt Philippa was bad news in November. They both looked at him. He signed with great dignity. I just waited for you two to figure it out. The spring came the way spring always comes in Toronto. Reluctantly, then all at once. One day it was February and the next it was May, or that was how it felt. And the trees on Harbord Street went from bare to full in what seemed like a single weekend. Adeline was behind the counter on a Saturday morning when Reid and Felix came in. She saw them from across the cafe, the door swinging shut behind them. Felix already scanning the room with his inventory-taking eyes, Reid shaking rain off his coat. Felix spotted her. His face did the thing, the almost smile, the shoulders going up thing, and he made a beeline for the counter. Dinosaur backpack replaced now by a smaller hiking pack, more age-appropriate, still slightly too large. He signed, "Did you save it?" She reached under the counter and produced the almond croissant on a small plate with a blueberry on the side because she'd learned he liked the color contrast. He signed, "You're the best." She signed back, "I know." Reid settled onto the counter stool. His regular spot on days when Felix was with him and they came to stay a while, and she poured his coffee without asking, dark roast black. He wrapped both hands around the mug the way he always did, and looked at her across the counter. And the morning light came in sideways through the windows and turned everything. For a moment, the particular gold of something ordinary becoming something you'll remember for the rest of your life. "How's the pottery?" he asked. "Terrible," she said. "I made something last week that I think might have been a bowl. My teacher called it evocative." "That's generous, extremely." Felix had taken his croissant to the corner booth, their booth, and was already setting up his watercolors on the table, small jars of water lined up in a row, brushes laid out in order of size. He looked up, caught Adeline watching him, and signed across the cafe, large enough for her to see from the counter. "Stop talking and come draw with me." Reid turned to look at his son, turned back. There was something in his face, that open thing, the one she'd first seen in October, and he didn't try to hide it. "He's right," Reid said. "Come draw with us." She untied her apron. Her colleague caught it before it hit the counter. Outside, the rain had stopped. The street was shining. Inside Birchwood, in the corner booth with the best light, a boy with opinions about croissants laid out a clean sheet of watercolor paper and waited, with the patience of someone who had learned that good things were worth waiting for the people he loved to come sit down.